The shoes sat by the door as if they owned the place. They were Italian leather, a deep oxblood red, polished to a near-liquid gleam. They were a size 11, ostentatious, and unequivocally not his. Liam stood in the entryway of his own apartment, the keys still cool in his palm, and regarded them with a calm that felt ancient and deep. He had walked in at noon on a Wednesday, a deliberate and calculated arrival. He had known this day would come, not because he suspected infidelity in the traditional, frantic sense, but because he had planned for it. For 3 years, every condescending glance, every backhanded compliment, every casual dismissal he had endured from his wife's family had been a deposit into an account of silent, meticulous patience. The interest had compounded daily in the quiet moments before sleep and the lonely hours before dawn. Today, that account was ready to be withdrawn in full. What Chloe and her family, the imperious Suttons, didn't know was that the man they saw as a mild-mannered, acceptably mediocre architect was a phantom of their own creation. The real Liam was a builder of different sorts, and he had spent the last 36 months laying the foundation for this very moment. Their colossal arrogance was the faulty bedrock upon which their empire was built, and he was about to demonstrate the precise, catastrophic physics of its collapse. It's a heart-stopping moment, isn't it? That instant when a truth you've prepared for finally arrives. I wonder where you're all watching from today as this story unfolds. Let me know in the comments below. We've all felt underestimated at some point, ignored or dismissed by people who thought they were better than us. This is a story about what happens when that quiet patience finally runs out. If you enjoy stories where the tables are turned and true worth is revealed, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because the fallout from those 2 gleaming leather shoes is just beginning. The memory that surfaced first was not one of rage, but of quiet, exquisite humiliation. It was from 2 months prior at the annual Sutton Foundation Gala, a night of forced smiles and starched collars. Liam stood beside Chloe, a ghost in a well-fitted but unremarkable tuxedo. Her father, Richard Sutton, a man whose presence filled a room like expanding concrete, was holding court. He clapped a heavy hand on Liam's shoulder, a gesture that was less camaraderie and more ownership. "And this is my son-in-law, Liam," Richard had boomed, his voice a finely tuned instrument of casual dominance. "He's an architect. Designs, well, you know, buildings." The word hung in the air, stripped of all its art and science, reduced to a child's block. A few of Richard's sycophants chuckled politely. "He's working on a lovely little community center over in Northwood," Richard continued, the word little landing with the weight of a wrecking ball. "Very quaint." Liam had simply smiled, a placid expression he had perfected over the years. It was his armor. Inside, he felt the familiar, cold click of a lock snapping into place. Another piece of evidence filed away. He had looked at Chloe, who was staring intently at her champagne flute, her knuckles white. She wouldn't meet his eyes. Her silence was its own kind of betrayal, a small, constant erosion of the ground beneath his feet. She loved him, he believed, but she loved the comfort of her family's approval more. She was a silent enabler, a bystander to his slow-motion execution. He didn't blame her, not entirely. The Suttons were a gravitational force, and Chloe had been in their orbit her entire life. But her inaction had consequences. As Richard moved on to his next anecdote, Liam had discreetly touched the thin, leather-bound portfolio he always carried. It was his symbolic object, his hidden truth. Inside were not sketches of community centers, but the preliminary blueprints for the Elysian Tower, the most ambitious and architecturally significant skyscraper to be built in the city in 50 years. A project so exclusive, its chief architect was known only by the pseudonym Ethelred. A project Richard Sutton would have killed to get his hands on. Liam's smile had remained unchanged, a mask of serene compliance. But in his mind, he had added another line item to the invoice he would one day deliver. Now, standing in his own home, the scent of an unfamiliar, expensive cologne mingling with the familiar smell of lemon polish and old books, Liam felt no anger. Anger was a hot, messy emotion, What he felt was colder, purer. He felt like a structural engineer who had just confirmed the final stress calculation. The collapse was no longer a theoretical possibility. It was an inevitability, proceeding along predictable lines of force. He could hear muted sounds from the bedroom down the hall. A low murmur of conversation, a soft laugh. He placed his portfolio on the small entryway table, setting it down with the quiet reverence of a priest placing a holy book on an altar. He took off his own shoes, simple, well-made black Oxfords, and placed them neatly beside the Oxblood invaders. A silent statement, a juxtaposition of substance and style. Then he walked softly into the living room, the plush rug silencing his footsteps. He sat down in his favorite armchair, the one with the worn leather that had molded to his shape over the years. He picked up a book from the side table, a dense volume on Renaissance urban planning, and opened it to his bookmark. And he began to read. He would not be the frantic, screaming husband. He would not give them the satisfaction of a dramatic scene of their making. The drama would be his, and it would unfold on his timetable. The quiet before the storm had officially begun. He turned a page, the dry rustle of the paper the only sound in the suddenly vast silence of his apartment. He could wait. He was excellent at waiting. The foundation of the Suttons' contempt had been laid on the day Liam first met them. It was a Sunday brunch at their palatial estate in the hills, a house that screamed of new money trying desperately to look like old. Eleanor Sutton, a woman who seemed to be sculpted from ice and disapproval, had appraised him over the rim of a teacup. An architect, she had said, her voice a delicate stiletto. How creative, she made it sound like a terminal diagnosis. Richard had been more direct. He'd grilled Liam about his firm, his clients, his 5-year plan. At the time, Liam was intentionally working for a small, boutique firm, a strategic choice to remain under the radar. He had given honest, modest answers. He saw the flicker of dismissal in Richard's eyes. He wasn't a predator. He wasn't a titan. He was inner-world a nobody, a safe, unthreatening, and ultimately disappointing choice for their daughter. Over the next 3 years, they had honed their condescension into an art form. It was in the gifts they gave him for Christmas, a gift certificate to a mid-range department store, a book on starting your own small business, while they gave Chloe jewelry that cost more than his car. It was in the way they introduced him to their friends, the slight pause before his name, the apologetic tilt of their head. This is Chloe's husband, Liam, never just Liam. Always an appendage, an afterthought. The most galling incident had been at his own 30th birthday dinner. He had wanted a quiet meal at his favorite Italian restaurant, a small, family-owned place with checkered tablecloths and phenomenal pasta. Chloe had agreed, but somehow the Suttons had invited themselves along. They arrived late, sweeping in with an air of profound inconvenience. Richard had looked at the menu with open disgust. Do they even have a wine list, or do we just point to red or white? He'd muttered, loud enough for the owner's son, who was their waiter, to hear. Eleanor had spent the entire meal recounting the triumphs of Chloe's ex-boyfriend, a hedge fund manager named Sterling who, in her telling, was a cross between a Greek god and a financial wizard. Sterling just bought a summer home in the Hamptons, she'd sighed, dabbing her lips with a napkin. A beautiful place, right on the water. It's so important to have assets. The implication was as subtle as a sledgehammer. Liam, with his rented apartment and his sensible sedan, had none. Liam had simply continued eating his lasagna, nodding at the appropriate moments. He had felt Chloe's hand find his under the table, a small, desperate squeeze. It was her apology, her plea for him to endure it, as she always did. And he had squeezed back, a gesture of reassurance. But it wasn't for her. It was for himself. He was a builder. He knew that the most important work happens before anyone sees the structure. You had to survey the land, test the soil, dig the foundations deep and strong. Every insult was a soil sample. Every slight was a measurement. He was learning the terrain of their arrogance, mapping its weaknesses, its fault lines. That night, after the disastrous dinner, he had gone home and transferred a significant sum of money into a new, private account. It was the first steel beam being lowered into the foundation of his new life. He remembered Chloe's brother, Marcus, a younger, cruder version of Richard. Marcus preferred direct assault to his parents' veiled condescension. At a family barbecue, he'd cornered Liam by the grill. "So, Liam," he'd slurred, a beer bottle clutched in his hand. "Still drawing your little houses? You know, my buddy just designed a new wing for the Museum of Modern Art. That's real architecture. Making a mark. What are you going to leave behind? A couple of renovated kitchens and a nice deck." Liam had just flipped the burgers, the smoke stinging his eyes. "Someone has to design the decks people like you stand on to feel important." "Marcus," he had replied quietly, his voice even. Marcus had blinked, too slow to catch the insult, and had just laughed, thinking Liam was agreeing with him. It was this blindness, this absolute certainty of their own superiority, that was their greatest vulnerability. They thought he was simple because he was quiet. They mistook patience for weakness. They looked at a blueprint and saw only lines on paper, never imagining the towering structure it represented. They lived in a world of surfaces, and Liam's entire life was about the hidden structures that hold everything up. And Chloe, her role in this was the most complex and painful. She was a product of her environment, polished and perfected by the Suttons to be an accessory to their legacy. She had fallen in love with Liam's quiet strength, his kindness, the way he listened. It was a rebellion of sorts, choosing him over the parade of Sterlings her mother had lined up. But her courage had its limits. She could love him in private, but in public, in the chilling shadow of her family, she would shrink. She would stand by, her face a mask of pain neutrality, as they chipped away at him. After each encounter, she would apologize profusely. "That's just how they are," she would whisper, her head on his chest. "They don't mean it. They just don't understand you," but they did understand him in their own way. They understood he wasn't one of them. And that was the one unforgivable sin. What she never understood was that he didn't want them to understand him. He needed them to underestimate him. Her failure to defend him was not just a weakness. It had become an integral part of his strategy. Her complicity provided the perfect camouflage. No one would ever suspect the man whose own wife couldn't stand up for him was capable of orchestrating their downfall. He had forgiven her for it, in a detached, clinical way. But forgiveness and absolution were two different things. He had forgiven the flaw in the design, but that didn't mean he wouldn't demolish the building. The sound of a door opening down the hall pulled him from his reverie. He didn't look up from his book. He remained perfectly still, a statue in the armchair. He heard a man's voice, low and confident. The voice of Julian Croft. Of course, it was perfect. Julian was a rival real estate developer, a man Richard Sutton both despised and desperately wanted to impress. Julian was everything the Suttons valued: flashy, ruthless, and born in a staggering wealth. For Chloe to be with him was not just an affair. It was a transaction. It was an upgrade. It was the ultimate validation of her family's belief system. A woman's footsteps followed, softer. Chloe. She was probably leading Julian out, thinking the coast was clear. Liam had told her he'd be on site at a project in the suburbs until at least 6. His noon arrival was a carefully planned disruption. They appeared at the edge of the living room. He saw them in his periphery. They stopped short. The silence was sudden and absolute. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Liam slowly, deliberately, placed his bookmark back in his book and closed it, the soft thud of the cover echoing in the stillness. He did not look at them. He looked straight ahead, at the large window that overlooked the city. Then he turned his head, his movements unhurried, his expression not of anger, but of mild curiosity, as if he'd found two strangers who had wandered into his home by mistake. Chloe's face was a canvas of pure horror. Her color drained away, leaving a sickly, pale sheen. Her hand flew to her mouth. Julian Croft, to his credit, recovered more quickly. He straightened his designer suit jacket, a flicker of arrogance warring with surprise in his eyes. He didn't know Liam, but he recognized the archetype, the cuckolded husband, the obstacle to be managed. "Well," Julian began, his voice smooth as polished marble, This is awkward. Liam's eyes finally met his. They were calm, clear, and utterly unreadable. Is it? Liam asked. His voice was quiet, yet it filled the room. It was not the voice of a victim. It was the voice of a man in complete control. I don't find it awkward. I find it clarifying. Chloe made a small, wounded sound, a choked sob. Liam, I can explain, can you? Liam's gaze shifted to her, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. It wasn't hurt. It was distance. It was the dispassionate look of an architect surveying a building slated for demolition. Please, Chloe, don't insult us both by attempting to. He stood up, his movements fluid and economical. He was not a large man, but in that moment, he seemed to tower over both of them. He walked past them, back towards the entryway, his posture perfect, his steps measured. He picked up his portfolio from a table. He turned back to face them, the portfolio held loosely in one hand. You should probably call your father, Chloe, he said, his tone conversational. In fact, you should probably call your mother, too. Tell them to come here. Right now. I believe we have some family business to discuss. Julian Croft scoffed, a short, sharp sound of derision. I don't think so. Chloe and I are leaving. You can deal with your little domestic drama on your own. Liam's eyes locked onto Julian's. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. You aren't going anywhere, Mr. Croft. You have a vested interest in the conversation we are about to have. You just don't know it yet. There was a certainty in his voice that gave Julian pause. For the first time, a sliver of doubt pierced his armor of arrogance. He looked at Liam, truly looked at him, and saw not a trampled man, but something else entirely. Something he couldn't name. Something that made the hairs on his arms stand up. The quiet before the storm was over. The first drops of rain had begun to fall. Chloe, spurred by a fear she couldn't articulate, fumbled for her phone. Her hand was shaking so badly she could barely unlock the screen. What are you doing, Liam? Please, let's not involve my parents. We can talk about this. Her voice was a thin, pleading whisper. We've been talking about this for 3 years, Chloe, Liam replied, his voice still unervingly calm. You just weren't listening. Now, everyone is going to listen. He gestured towards her phone with his portfolio. Make the call, Julian Croft, ever the predator, sensing a shift in power dynamics, decided to reassert his dominance. He took a step forward, puffing out his chest slightly. Look, pal, I don't know who you think you are, but you have no right to order anyone around. Chloe can do what she wants. If she wants to leave with me, she will. Liam didn't even flinch. He simply held Julian's gaze. My name is Liam, and I'm the man who is about to systematically dismantle everything your future business partner, Richard Sutton, has ever built. That's who I am. So, I would advise you to stay. The information I'm about to share will be critical to your own financial survival. The specificity of the threat, the sheer audacity of it, hit Julian like a physical blow. He froze. The name Richard Sutton, connected with the phrase systematically dismantle, created a cognitive dissonance that his arrogant mind couldn't immediately process. This wasn't the script for a spurned husband. This was something else entirely. Chloe, meanwhile, had managed to call her father. Her conversation was a series of stammers and choked sobs. Dad, you need to come over. Yes, to Liam's. No, just come. And bring Mom. It's important. She hung up, looking at Liam with wide, terrified eyes. They're on their way. They're angry. Liam, what have you done? I've done what you and your family taught me to do, he said, his voice softening for a moment, a sliver of the old Liam showing through. I've learned to be patient, to plan, to build. He turned and walked back to his armchair, sitting down as if he were settling in to watch a play. He placed the portfolio on his lap, his fingers resting lightly on the smooth leather. The 20 minutes that followed were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Liam said nothing. He simply sat, the picture of tranquility, occasionally turning a page in his book, which he had picked up again. Chloe paced the length of the living room, her agitation growing with every passing second. She kept shooting desperate glances at Julian, who stood stiffly by the doorway, his mind clearly racing, re-evaluating every assumption he'd ever made about risk and power. He was trapped. Leaving now felt more dangerous than staying. The silence in the apartment was thick and heavy, punctuated only by the frantic rhythm of Chloe's breathing and the distant wail of a city siren. The doorbell rang, a shrill, impatient buzz that shattered the tension. Chloe jumped as if she'd been electrocuted. Liam, however, calmly placed his bookmark in his book, closed it, and set it on the table. He stood up. "That would be them," he said, with the simple finality of a narrator announcing the beginning of the third act. He walked to the door and opened it. Richard and Eleanor Sutton stood in the hallway, their faces thunderous. Richard's big frame seemed to fill the entire doorway. Eleanor stood just behind him, her lips a thin, bloodless line of disapproval. "What is the meaning of this, Liam?" Richard bellowed, striding into the apartment without being invited. "Chloe calls us hysterical. What kind of scene are you making?" Eleanor swept in after him, her eyes immediately cataloging everything in the room, her gaze landing on Julian Croft with a flicker of shock, followed by a complex expression that was part calculation, part disdain for the messiness of it all. "Julian," she said, her voice like ice chips. "What a surprise." Richard's eyes followed hers, and his face hardened as he saw Julian. He turned to Chloe. "What is he doing here? What is going on?" But before Chloe could stammer out a reply, Liam closed the door, the soft click sealing them all inside. He turned to face his in-laws. "Richard, Eleanor, thank you for coming on such short notice," he said, his voice polite, as if they had been invited for tea. "Please have a seat. We have a great deal to discuss," Richard scoffed. "I'm not sitting anywhere. You're going to tell me what you've done to upset my daughter, and then you're going to apologize." "I haven't done anything, Richard," Liam said, walking back toward the center of the room. He was no longer just a man in a room. He was the master of ceremonies. "I've simply created a space for some truths to be revealed. For example, the truth that my wife has been sleeping with your prospective business partner." He gestured towards Julian, his hand steady. The statement landed. Simple, devastating, final. Eleanor let out a sharp gasp. Richard's face went from red to a deep, mottled purple. He looked from Chloe's tear-streaked face to Julian's stony expression, and the disgusting truth settled on him. But his first instinct was not concern for his daughter's marriage. It was damage control. "This is a private matter," he snarled at Liam. "You had no right to drag us into it." "On the contrary," Liam replied, his voice hardening, losing its gentle edge and taking on the unyielding quality of steel. "This is where it stops being a private matter. Because this isn't about infidelity. That's just a symptom. This is about business. It's about the Sutton Spire." At the mention of his legacy project, Richard's attention snapped fully to Liam. The Sutton Spire was his obsession, the monument he intended to build to himself, a testament to his power and vision. It was also a deeply troubled project, over-leveraged and desperate for a world-class architectural firm to give it the prestige it needed to attract flagship tenants. "What about it?" Richard growled, a sense of unease starting to creep into his voice. "For the last 6 months," Liam continued, his pacing slow and deliberate, "you have been trying to secure a partnership with the most sought-after architectural firm in the country. A firm known for its innovation, its discretion, and its visionary designs. A firm known only as Ethelred and Vance." Richard stared at him, bewildered. "What does that have to do with you? Get to the point." Liam walked over to his portfolio, which was still resting on the armchair. He picked it up. He held it in front of him, a simple black leather case. "The point, Richard," he said, "is that you've been trying to get a meeting with the firm's reclusive, anonymous lead designer. The man they call Ethelred." He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of the name fill the room. He saw the flicker of recognition in Julian Croft's eyes, the dawning horror on Chloe's face. Richard and Eleanor just looked confused, impatient. "The point," Liam said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a quiet bomb that would shatter their world, "is that you've had him at your dinner table for the last 3 years. You just never thought to ask him about his work." He laid the portfolio on the coffee table and unzipped it. He slid out a thick, rolled-up set of blueprints and a single, heavy sheet of paper. He unrolled the blueprints. They were the unmistakable, breathtaking designs for the Sutton Spire, but with details and flourishes Richard had only dreamed of. The signature in the corner was a stylized. Then he slid the other document across the table. It was a certificate of incorporation for Ethelred and Vance. Listed as the majority shareholder and chief executive officer was one name, Liam Carter. The silence that followed was more profound than any shouting could ever be. It was the sound of a world ending. Richard Sutton stared at the documents on the table, his brain refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. He looked from the elegant signature on the blueprints to the name on the corporate filing, and then up at the face of the man he had dismissed as a mediocrity for 3 years. The man he had mocked for designing quaint community centers. The calm, unassuming son-in-law he had so thoroughly and utterly underestimated. He sank onto the sofa, his massive frame suddenly looking deflated, his face a mask of disbelief. Eleanor stood frozen, her hand clutching her pearls, her carefully constructed composure finally cracking. The implications were cascading through her mind, not just socially, but financially. They had not just insulted their daughter's husband. They had alienated the one man who held the key to their entire future. Chloe was openly weeping now, a gut-wrenching sound of despair. She wasn't crying for her marriage. She was crying for her own catastrophic blindness. Every belittling comment, every dismissive joke, every moment she had stood by and let her family diminish Liam now replayed in her mind, cast in a new, horrifying light. She had been married to a king and had allowed her family to treat him like a court jester. Julian Croft, ever the opportunist, was the first to speak. His tone had changed completely. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a fawning, desperate urgency. Ethelred, he said, the name tasting foreign and reverent on his tongue. My God, I had no idea. Richard, did you know? He was already distancing himself, repositioning himself from accomplice to fellow victim of the deception. But before Richard could answer, another player entered the stage. The doorbell rang again, this time a calm, polite chime. Liam didn't seem surprised. That will be my partner, he said, walking to the door. I thought it would be best to have her here to answer any technical questions you might have about the termination of our contracts. He opened the door to reveal a woman in a sharply tailored suit. She was poised with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. This was Ava Chun, the Vance of Ethelred and Vance. The public face of the company, the operational genius who executed Liam's vision. Ava, thank you for coming, Liam said. This is the Sutton family. And Mr. Croft? Ava nodded, her expression professional but cool. She carried a briefcase. Richard, she said, her voice crisp and businesslike. We've spoken on the phone. Richard looked up, his face ashen. He recognized her voice. She was the gatekeeper he had never been able to get past, the woman who had politely but firmly rebuffed his every attempt to meet with Ethelred. You? He stammered. I don't understand. It's quite simple, Ava said, opening her briefcase on the coffee table next to Liam's blueprints. Ethelred and Vance has a strict policy of not working with clients who fail our due diligence process, a process that evaluates not just financial viability, but character. She pulled out a thick folder. Liam, as the firm's founder, has always insisted that we only partner with people who demonstrate integrity, respect, and professionalism. In your dealings with me, you were arrogant and dismissive. In your dealings with him, she gestured to Liam, you have been contemptuous. She then looked directly at Julian Croft. Mr. Croft, your own firm, Croft Developments, was also under consideration for the Phoenix project. I believe this afternoon's activities have given us all the data we need to make a final decision on that as well. Julian paled. The Phoenix project was a massive urban renewal contract worth billions. Ethelred and Vance were the lead architects. Being blacklisted by them didn't just mean losing a contract. It meant being marked in the industry as toxic. This has nothing to do with business, he sputtered, grasping for a defense. This was a personal matter. Everything is about business, Mr. Croft, Liam said quietly, speaking for the first time since Ava's arrival. You made a calculated decision that sleeping with the wife of a man you perceived as weak and unimportant was a risk worth taking. A cost-benefit analysis. The benefit was indulging your ego and perhaps gaining some leverage over Richard. The cost, you assumed, was negligible. Your analysis was flawed. You miscalculated the value of the primary asset. The calm, analytical way he broke it down was more chilling than any emotional outburst. He was applying the cold logic of architecture to the messy chaos of their lives. He was showing them the structural flaws in their own characters. Ava slid another document out her folder. This is a formal notice of the termination of Ethelred and Vance's preliminary consulting agreement regarding the Sutton Spire project, effective immediately. We are invoking the moral turpitude clause. Richard finally found his voice, a strangled roar of fury and desperation. You can't do that. We have an agreement. I'll sue you. I'll sue you for everything you have. Do you? Ava asked, raising a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. Your preliminary agreement is with A&V. Liam personally holds the patent on the structural innovations and the copyright on the aesthetic design that make the spire viable. Without him, you don't have a project. You have a very expensive hole in the ground. And as for suing him, she paused, letting the moment hang in the air. You should be more concerned about him suing you. Liam stepped forward. For 3 years, Richard, you have had access to my ideas. At dinners, at holidays, you would ask about my little projects, and I would talk about concepts. I spoke of cantilevered green spaces, of self-regulating thermal glass, of kinetic facades, ideas you dismissed as fanciful. And yet, 6 months later, those exact concepts appeared in your prospectus for the spire. Presented as your own vision, he tapped the blueprints on the table. I have documented every single one of those conversations. The dates, the times, the witnesses. It's called intellectual property theft, a concept you, of all people, should understand. The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Richard, the great titan, reduced to a common thief, stealing ideas from the son-in-law he disdained. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was checkmated. Every move he could make would lead to ruin. Eleanor, seeing her husband broken, turned her venom on the only target she had left. You did this to us, she hissed at Chloe. You and your pathetic taste in men. I told you he was nothing. I didn't realize he was a snake as well. He's not the snake. Mother, Chloe whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. She finally looked at Liam, truly seeing the man she had married and betrayed. It was the first honest thing she had said in years. Liam looked at her, and in his eyes, there was no triumph, only a deep, profound sadness. The divorce papers will be sent to your parents' address, he said softly. I've already moved my things into a new residence. The lease on this apartment is in my name alone. I'd like you all to be gone within the hour, he turned to Ava. I think we're done here. Ava nodded, packed her briefcase with swift efficiency, and they walked towards the door, leaving the ruins of the Sutton family scattered in the wreckage of their living room. As Liam opened the door to leave, he paused and looked back at Richard. You were right about one thing, Richard, he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. I do design community centers. My firm is currently designing and funding the construction of 3 of them, pro bono, in the city's most underserved neighborhoods. Because I believe in building things that last. Things that have value beyond their price tag. You should try it sometime. And with that, he walked out, closing the doors softly behind him. The sound of it clicked the final definitive end to a chapter of his life. The days that followed were a blur of legal correspondence and quiet, decisive action. Liam had been preparing for this moment for so long that the execution felt almost anticlimactic. His lawyers, a top-tier firm he had retained over a year ago, moved with surgical precision. The divorce filing was simple and non-negotiable. He wanted nothing from Chloe that they had acquired together. He simply wanted to sever the connection. His only demand was that she vacate the apartment, which she did within 2 days, leaving behind a home that was suddenly silent and spacious. The real shockwave hit the city's financial and real estate sectors. The news that Ethelred and Vance had publicly and acrimoniously severed ties with Sutton Development was the lead story in every business journal. The official reason cited was irreconcilable professional differences and a failure to meet the firm's ethical standards. The language was just vague enough to be devastating, inviting speculation and scrutiny. As Liam had predicted, the withdrawal of his firm's prestige and, more importantly, his proprietary designs caused Richard Sutton's house of cards to tremble. The primary international investors, who had been lured in by the promise of Ethelred's involvement, began to pull out. Their withdrawal triggered covenant breaches in Richard's loans. Banks that had once courted him now called in their debts. Richard, who had always operated with the swaggering confidence of a man who believed he was too big to fail, found himself suddenly, terrifyingly vulnerable. He tried to fight back. He gave an interview decrying Ethelred and Vance's unprofessionalism and vowing to find a new, better architect. But the damage was done. The story of his son-in-law, the hidden genius he had tormented, began to leak out. It was too delicious a piece of gossip to stay contained. The narrative of the arrogant titan brought low by the humble genius he underestimated was irresistible. Richard became a cautionary tale, a laughingstock in the very circles he had once dominated. Liam watched it all from a distance. He took no pleasure in Richard's downfall, but he felt a quiet sense of rightness, of balance restored. He had not acted out of vengeance, but out of a need to correct a fundamental injustice. He had built a life based on substance, and the Suttons had tried to tear it down with superficiality. He had simply revealed the true nature of the materials. His own life, meanwhile, was undergoing a profound transformation. Freed from the oppressive weight of the Suttons' judgment and the constant, low-level stress of hiding his true self, he felt lighter. He moved into a penthouse apartment in a building he himself had designed years ago under his pseudonym. It was a space of clean lines, natural light, and breathtaking views of the city skyline. A home that was a true reflection of his aesthetic and his soul. He poured his energy into his work. He officially came out as Ethelred, the enigmatic genius behind the firm. The revelation caused another sensation, but Liam handled the ensuing media attention with the same quiet dignity he handled everything else. He gave one in-depth interview to an architectural journal, explaining his philosophy of design and his belief in building with purpose. He spoke of his passion for public works and his desire to create spaces that enriched communities. He became not just a celebrated architect, but a respected public figure. About a month after the confrontation, he received a letter. It was from Chloe. He recognized her elegant, looping handwriting on the envelope. He let it sit on his desk for a day, a silent testament to a past he was determined to leave behind. When he finally opened it, he found a long, multi-page letter. It was not a plea for reconciliation. It was an apology, a real one. She took full responsibility for her weakness, for her complicity in her family's cruelty. She wrote about how his revelation had forced her to look at herself and her family with clear eyes for the first time in her life. She saw the hollowness, the obsession with status, the utter lack of genuine worth. She was trying to build a life on her own terms now, away from her parents' influence. She was working a modest job at an art gallery. She didn't ask for his forgiveness. She simply stated that she was sorry and that she hoped he was happy. He read the letter, folded it carefully, and put it away. He felt a pang of sadness for the woman she could have been, but no regret for the decision he had made. Some structures are simply built on a faulty foundation. You can't renovate them. You have to tear them down and start over. He hoped she would find the strength to do so. A few weeks later, Ava brought him a piece of news. Julian Croft's company was facing a hostile takeover. After being blacklisted by ANV, his reputation had been shattered. His investors lost confidence, and his rivals sensed blood in the water. He had made the classic mistake of the arrogant. He had assumed his power was inherent, not contingent on reputation and relationships. By choosing to align himself with the Suttons' brand of dismissive cruelty, he had shown the world his own character, and the world had judged him accordingly. The poetic justice was not lost on Liam. Julian's fate was a direct consequence of the choice he made in that apartment, the choice to treat another human being as an obstacle rather than a person. The final piece fell into place 2 months after that. Liam was in a meeting, reviewing plans for a new children's hospital, when his lawyer called. Sutton Development had officially filed for bankruptcy. Richard's empire, built on leverage and intimidation, had crumbled into dust. The Sutton Spire was now nothing more than a stalled construction site, a monument to one man's hubris. Liam felt a quiet finality. The invoice had been paid in full. The account was closed. He ended the call and turned his attention back to the blueprints on the table. He was focused on the design of a pediatric oncology wing, thinking about how to maximize natural light, how to create a space that felt hopeful and healing for sick children and their families. He was building again. That was what he did. That was who he was. He built things that were strong, true, and meant to last. The noise of the Suttons and their collapsed world was already fading, becoming a distant, irrelevant echo. 6 months later, Liam stood on the observation deck of the Elysian Tower. The project, his secret masterpiece, was nearing completion. It was a soaring, elegant structure of glass and steel that seemed to scrape the heavens, a testament to what could be achieved with vision, patience, and integrity. The city spread out below him, a glittering tapestry of light and life. He wasn't alone. Ava was there, as was the mayor and several members of the city council. They were there for a private pre-opening tour. The mayor was clapping him on the back, talking about how the tower had revitalized the entire downtown core. "You've given the city a new heart, Liam," she said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "We're all incredibly grateful." Liam simply smiled. He looked out at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. In the distance, he could just make out the dark, skeletal frame of the stalled Sutton Spire, a stark contrast to the gleaming beacon on which he stood. He thought about the nature of true strength. The Suttons believed strength was loud, that it was about dominance, wealth, and the power to diminish others. They were wrong. True strength was quiet. It was the deep, unseen foundation that could withstand any storm. It was the patience to wait for the right moment. It was the integrity to build something of value, not just for yourself, but for others. It was the dignity to withstand humiliation without becoming hateful, and the wisdom to wield power without becoming cruel. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Chloe. He hadn't heard from her since the letter. He opened it. It was a simple message. "I saw a picture of the Elysian Tower. It's beautiful. Congratulations. You deserve it." He looked at the message for a long moment. Then he typed back a simple reply. "Thank you. I hope you're well." He put the phone back in his pocket. It was a final, gentle closing of a door. Not forgiveness in the sense of forgetting, but an acknowledgement of a shared past and a quiet release. He had his justice, but he had not lost his humanity. Later that evening, he was back in his apartment, sketching in his notebook. He wasn't designing a skyscraper or a hospital. He was sketching a small, simple bench for a park. He was thinking about the grain of the wood, the curve of the back, the way it would feel to sit there on a sunny afternoon. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Everything you build matters. The shoes by the door, the foundation of a building, the structure of a life. It all had to be built with care. He had torn one life down, a life built on lies and disrespect. But in its place, he had built something better, something stronger, something true. And as he looked out his window at the city lights, at the Elysian Tower standing tall and proud against the night sky, he knew, with a certainty that was as solid as bedrock, that this was just the beginning. The architect was finally home. The story of Liam and the Suttons serves as a powerful reminder about the nature of worth and respect. So often, the world tries to measure us by superficial things, our jobs, our possessions, the families we marry into. But true worth isn't something that can be given or taken away by others. It's something we build within ourselves, quietly, patiently, day by day. It's in the integrity of our work, the kindness we show to others, and the dignity we maintain in the face of disrespect. Liam's victory wasn't just in exposing the Suttons. It was in remaining true to himself throughout the entire ordeal. He never stooped to their level. He didn't become cruel, or vengeful. He simply allowed their own arrogance and blindness to be the cause of their downfall. He built a better world for himself not by destroying them, but by outbuilding them in every way that truly matters. What do you think is the most important lesson from this story? Is it the power of patience, the importance of integrity, or the simple satisfaction of seeing arrogance get what it deserves? I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. It's through sharing these stories and discussing these ideas that we can all learn and grow. If you found this story of vindication and justice satisfying, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel for more content just like this. Every subscription helps us continue to create stories that resonate and inspire. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.